Hi, what a great pleasure to welcome you all, see friends old and new, and just begin this fifth annual conference. This first panel is on well-being and flourishing. We have the great privilege to welcome Melissa Cardon and Tom Lumpkin, both from the University of Tennessee, Jeffrey McMullen from Indiana University, and Ute Stephan from King's College London. As Brett said, we're running 40-minute panels, so we'll go pretty quickly. If I could ask Dr. Ute the first question. You've done a lot of work on burnout for entrepreneurs and policymakers. How do you convince policymakers, scholars, academics, the necessity of the solutions and effectiveness of approach to burnout, specifically where faith and entrepreneurship come together?
Right. Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for having me and putting this lovely conference together. It's an honor to be here. It's great to see everything grow. Right. I'm going to segue now to well-being and flourishing. I thought, in the spirit of having a discussion, no slides, but I want to talk a bit more about well-being first, and then kind of maybe go into discussion there. So the background is basically that what we see in entrepreneurship, and for those who are not kind of focused on well-being, it's probably also not a surprise. Entrepreneurs have simultaneously both kind of the best job, very great potential for fulfillment, for flourishing, very meaningful work, lots of autonomy, but at the same time also kind of the worst job in the sense of it's very intense, there's a lot of stress, and a high risk for burnout. And often, I think that the really tricky bit here is that if you're very passionate about what you're doing, you have very high aspirations for yourself, as entrepreneurs have, you enjoy what you're doing, you don't necessarily realize that you're burning out or that you're under stress. And then if I'm thinking of Melissa's work as well, it was shown that actually working really hard and putting everything in is paying off financially, at least in the short term. And this time element is quite critical because the negative effects of stress on our body only materialize with a certain time delay. And so especially if you have young, ambitious entrepreneurs, it's a really difficult conversation to have, to say you should look after yourself because that's going to sustain yourself. But I think what helps is, one, kind of to make the business case, kind of saying, oh, we know actually from research well-being is related to kind of positive outcomes, although there could be a lot more research to be done in that field, I think, but maybe also kind of pointing out the downside. So what happens if you're very stressed and you make decisions? You may make very poor decisions, and they can be costly to your business, to yourself, maybe even to your family, because often you put up family assets as collateral. So in that sense, there is a case to try to convince the entrepreneurs, even though it's hard. What helps sometimes is role models of entrepreneurs who talk about their well-being routines, but also sadly role models who talk about how they've gone through burnout and how they now do things differently. But it's still a difficult conversation to have with the entrepreneurs when they're wrapped up in their work, and especially if there is a faith component to it, that makes it even more meaningful for what you do and the purpose you pursue. So then kind of that led us, and some of this, the OECD is a policy think tank. They actually approached Johan Wicklund and myself to kind of write something what policymakers could do. But I think before the policymakers are the direct supporters. So often when, I get asked, so how do you know entrepreneurs burned out? I think the entrepreneur is maybe less likely to know, and sooner than the entrepreneur, it's going to be family members and friends who can tell. So, we need to bring them into the fold. And then, of course, the investors are also close supporters. And there is, especially in, if you have national business banks, they often are the main finance provider directly or indirectly to the nation's entrepreneurs. So they could also actually play an important role. And there is the so-called Founder Mental Health Pledge out of Silicon Valley, which is a global nonprofit. And I I like what they're trying to do. They're trying to destigmatize conversations around mental health so that the entrepreneurs are given more license to look after themselves. And then the little nudge, if you want, is to incorporate in the term sheet that you can use the money you've been given as an investment to also look after yourself and your well-being. And that's something that, the national investment banks might use it as well. It's less, I think, about the actual cost incurred and much more valuable as a signal that, it's okay to look after yourself. And also it's okay not to be okay as an entrepreneur and to realize and appreciate all the stresses that come with it. And actually, I think if we were to realize and appreciate those stresses, not realize, appreciate those stresses and be perhaps a bit more honest about what entrepreneurship entails, maybe that also would pave the way for even more people to kind of commit if they have if they were given license or feel they could give themselves license to look after themselves and, maybe every once in a while slow down. So yeah, it's not an easy conversation to have, but I think it's a necessary conversation to have. And I'm all for celebrating entrepreneurship, but I do think the individuals and by extension, also the businesses involved need to be sustainable, and the businesses often only are sustained if the individuals who are leading them can sustain themselves and have license to do so. In the spirit of keeping on time, I might leave it there.
Thank you. Wonderful. I would love to hear more about that, especially in the group conversation and the role of faith in both the family and in the individual entrepreneurs in dealing with those stresses. Thank you. We'll move on to Melissa Cardon, from stress to loneliness. You've done some excellent work, very interesting on the benefits of loneliness and looking at how loneliness can be effectively modulated for positive outcomes in entrepreneurs. So I would love to hear about that, and especially the role of faith in modulating loneliness. So Melissa, please.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Corey, and thank you, Ute. So it's interesting. Becca Arwine and I did a study in personnel psychology. Ute was actually our action editor, so did a great job helping us get that paper improved. And we actually went out and found 8,000 posts on Reddit about entrepreneurial loneliness from entrepreneurs, where they talked about, are they lonely? Are they not lonely? How do they deal with it? And it surprised us to find out some of them said, yeah, we're lonely, but that's good because we can focus singularly on our venture. We can be productive. We can just ignore everything else and everybody else. Now, I'm going to put the caution out there and say we believe that this is a lone wolf rhetoric. We are not sure this is healthy. And we also suspect that they're getting to that point after they've gotten through that phase of their business and become successful, because by and large, entrepreneurship is lonely and it is not good, even though there is this narrative and rhetoric out there for some of them that they think it is good or irrelevant for a while. I think more importantly, we found that when entrepreneurs experience loneliness, they can cope with it in very different ways. And some of those are productive and some of those are really destructive to the burnout point, and drugs and alcohol and all kinds of negative coping behaviors, avoidance coping behaviors. The helpful coping behaviors involved engaging in some kind of activity that created meaningful connections with other people. And so sometimes that was joining entrepreneurship groups or entrepreneurial startup groups or co-founder groups, so people really understood what they were going through as founders. But sometimes that was actually, more to Ute's point, stepping completely away from the business, doing something hobby related that was not helping instrumentally with their business, going to a yacht club, taking dancing lessons, something else where they could form a meaningful connection with other people and get away from the hustle, drive culture of entrepreneurship. It wasn't directly part of our study, but I suspect this is where the religion or faith could come into play, because some of those meaningful connections with others could be through a faith-based community. They could be a relationship with one's deity, what God, Buddha, whatever, that's giving one that purpose of, I'm not alone because I'm walking this path with someone else or something else. So that wasn't part of the study, but it's certainly an interesting speculation. And in a completely different project, I just want to showcase Becca's work, my co-author on that P-Psych study. And Becca has a long history with L.I.F.E and with Miami, but her dissertation was about founders and their healthy relationships with their ventures, and how a certain accelerator program could help them do more introspection about their relationships with other people, relationships with themselves, different identities that they hold, and essentially how they could do that reflective work to create better harmony with themselves and their ventures in other ways. And part of that story for the data that she unveiled was indeed faith, and how faith played an important role in these people's lives. That's it. I'm going to move on to the conversation because I think there's a lot more we can talk about with one another.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks for looping in, Becca, too. I'd like to turn to Tom Lumpkin. You've done a lot of work on civic wealth creation and how civic wealth can support flourishing. I'd like to hear more about that, and specifically any connections between faith entrepreneurship and civic wealth. So Tom, welcome.
Thanks. Thank you for the question. And thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for the great conference. So I'd like to answer by drawing attention not so much to the creation part of civic wealth creation, but to civic wealth itself as an asset or a resource or an endowment. An underlying assumption of civic wealth creation is that wealth refers to more than just money and material possessions. And it is these other forms of wealth that I think are especially important these days for helping entrepreneurs with flourishing and well-being. I like to use capital as a proxy for wealth. I think it's kind of a useful proxy, and there's this community capitals framework for talking about wealth that refers to both the natural environment and the built environment. It includes social capital, human capital, political capital, and cultural capital, as well as financial capital. And I think sort of embedded in those and interwoven with those there are two other forms of wealth that are important, that are part of this whole civic wealth, social and communal wealth idea, and those are trust and community itself. And so these resources, these endowments, that is trust and community, are especially important in these times of high uncertainty, dramatic uncertainty about financial wealth. So in a world where the US stock market can lose $6 trillion in 2 days, it seems to me that these other forms of wealth are especially important for flourishing and well-being, and can help sustain and support a person of faith. So the idea of trust and community are really related in a faith community. I recently saw an interview with the acclaimed political thinker Francis Fukuyama, who has a book entitled Trust. And one of the quotes from that book is, "Communities depend on mutual trust and will not arise spontaneously without it." And so I think in an era of questionable trust or uncertainty around trust, it's important to keep that in mind. He talks about community in terms of these underlying notions of shared ethical norms. And so in that way, his notion of community, which can be defined much more broadly, are sort of similar to the reason that we actually use the term civic in writing the article about civic wealth creation, because it does suggest this idea of common bonds and experiences, a sense of responsibility for others that go beyond strictly economic considerations. So to the question, how might faith contribute to civic wealth? The answer, at least in part, is related to this connection between faith and trust. You know, the two words are almost synonymous. Faith is sort of more spiritually focused on one's relationship with God, and trust being more socially focused on one's relationship with others. Faith can contribute to the kind of trust that is needed to give rise to communities, the kind of communities that Fukuyama was talking about, and that are implied by the notion of civic wealth, consisting of shared norms and common bonds. And also, even though a lot of spiritual faith is personal, an inside job, people don't typically practice their faith alone. They're part of faith communities, and these communities can often be models of the kind of diverse and caring and mutually supportive settings that are indicative of civic wealth and have the ingredients and wherewithal to create civic wealth. So faith, I believe, promotes the creation of civic wealth and is itself a type of wealth. So let me finish with a comment about the converse, about how civic wealth might contribute to faith, or at least to an entrepreneur wishing to integrate their faith with their entrepreneurship. It seems to me that reliable information, good information, trustworthy information is much harder to find these days. Between fake news and obfuscating politicians and the questionable veracity of AI, it's not that easy to find good information, but entrepreneurs rely on good information. And so I believe it's actually in communities where there is trust and responsibility and a sort of accountability as part of the norm of the group. I believe entrepreneurs and others can find trustworthy information and knowledge needed to make more well-considered decisions and take action with greater confidence. So in this way, I think civic wealth can also sort of give back, if you will, to faith, to be supportive of people of faith. So I'll stop there and also wait for the questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tom. So we move from healthy and well integrated to communities to a healthy and well integrated entrepreneur. Jeff McMullen has written and talked about the year of the whole person entrepreneur. I'd like to hear, Jeff, more about the relational dynamics that are most central to incorporating the whole person into entrepreneurial action and well-being, and specifically, where's faith in that? So welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm not the expert that the other three panelists are here on well-being, but I'll talk a little bit about some patterns we saw. If you look at this was Angelique's idea to write a review piece. Basically, we went through when we were deciding best paper of the year and went through everything in 2023. And out of that came a theme, an emergent theme of this idea of the whole person entrepreneur, where you weren't really just looking at a function, but you were looking at really an understanding of the entrepreneur as a well-rounded person that has relations, is in community, has troubles, worries, concerns, all these things, has lots of other roles in their life beyond just being the entrepreneur and just being at work. And then we did the same thing this year, and the theme that really came out this year was entrepreneurial agency, and so it was almost an extension to some extent. But last year's theme was mostly about that. And then if you look at the context where that really played out a lot, were some pretty severe uncertainty. Like people were dealing with some uncertainty. They were either refugees, they were displaced, their lives had been turned upside down in many cases and had to revisit a lot of the assumptions of how do I relate to the world? How do I relate to the other people around me? And so uncertainty was a key theme, and we've seen that in entrepreneurship. So unfortunately, entrepreneurship has a lot to say about how to wrestle and deal with uncertainty. And then a couple other themes that really pop up and come out of that are meaning. What is meaningful? And entrepreneurship as meaning making, not just to put food on the table, but I mean it's a way to make sense of what's going on around you. Make sense of the chaos in your life to some extent. Self-discovery, the way hope plays out, and that would be really the third theme that I saw emerge a lot was hope. What is hope? And that notion was there, wasn't really technically addressed. The few times I did see it in the literature a little bit discussed, it was that positive psychology version of hope, which is different than the hope that most of us would talk about in this room, I would say. And so it was interesting seeing those three themes play out. So in this question, I kind of reflected on what do what do I see in the literature? What do I see in practice in terms of how entrepreneurs seek well-being through these relational dynamics? And to me, there's really two major things. One is that they seek an objective standard by which to measure their lives. So Clayton Christensen talked about how you measure your life, and I love that article. I think it's a great piece to kind of reflect on this. But there is some kind of, whether you recognize it in religion provides it. Whether you're talking the Old Testament law or New Testament Beatitudes, or the virtues of Stoic philosophy, or just Omar's code from The Wire, whatever it is, whatever code it is that you live by, that you've accepted for your life, and some people have articulated it, some people haven't. How do you measure up against that? And that helps somewhat with the relational dynamic, in the sense that it's with an objective standard that isn't changing constantly. And so you see anxiety go down to some extent as a result of that, because you're not constantly changing the definition of what a good person is, or what a good day is, or how am I doing. And as a result of that, you don't have the same, you're not always seeing yourself and through a broken mirror, which is basically other people, because other people too are falling short of their own standards. And so it gives some kind of calibration there. And so that's one element. From what I've seen a little bit in the psychoanalytical literature and getting into some of that, it does lead to some anxiety reduction if somebody can make peace with the fact that they fall short of that standard regularly. So they have to have some sort of self-compassion. Another piece that I think is really fascinating in both this literature that comes out of this literature and comes out of other literatures as well, and that's confronting the brutal facts of one's situation, oneself. So in many of these cases, we've talked a lot about optimism in entrepreneurship, and we hold it on up high, but it's actually not the best situation. I mean, I love an anecdote from Admiral Stockdale, who was a prisoner of war in a prisoner of war camp in Vietnam, and they talked about who were the first to basically fall, and give up. And it was the pessimists were the first to go, and then the next to go were the optimists, because they kept setting false expectations of when they were going to get out of the camp, and then those would get dashed, and their hearts would break slowly over time. And the ones that got out, so you're like, who's left? It was the realists. The realists were the ones that would confront the brutal facts that I'm going to likely die in this prisoner of war camp. I've seen many, many people die here. We're probably not going to get out, but they still clung to hope that I'm still going to move forward, because there's a chance that possibly I won't die here. And so it's a weird dichotomy here, but we see it often in the entrepreneurship literature. It's a notion of affordable loss, is making peace with the worst outcome that's possible. It's like it's imagining all the scenarios that could play out, saying, if I fail, this is what it's going to look like, and it's going to be terrible, and I don't want that to happen, but can I make peace with that? And if I can make peace with that, now everything's a win in relation to that. I've made peace with it. And then the uncertainty, the emotional vicissitudes we feel from the uncertainty are quelled to some extent, where we can focus and think and appreciate every small gain you have along the way, because you know what could happen. It could be very, very ugly. And honestly, I wish I could give the literature credit for finding that, but I moved a lot growing up, and I know it's true, because I came to terms with that in realization very young age, and realizing when you move and you go through this and have to redefine your relationships with new kids at new schools every couple of years, you better learn how to make peace with uncertainty. And this is something that I think that we don't talk enough about in class. I think Ute was totally right about that, and this honesty. But if you read literature, not our literature, but you end up into the really decent pop press literature, the entrepreneurs always talk about the emotional vicissitudes. Anybody that's been an entrepreneur knows the weight of the relationships of having employees and worrying and waking up every night about payroll. Anybody that's run an organization that's responsible knows what it's like when it's on your shoulders, and you're like, if I fail, then I'm letting a lot of people down around me. It's a heavy, heavy, heavy weight. And so I think us bringing this in and talking about what are the tools, and not just from our own literature, but drawing from other literatures on how do people wrestle with uncertainty, how do they make meaning, how do they use hope in a practical way to better their lives and the lives of those around them. It's essential. It's not a choice. It'd be irresponsible if we didn't do that in the classroom, because it'd be unethical. We're basically giving people a Pollyanna view of what entrepreneurship is going to be, rather than a realistic account of these are the struggles you're going to have ahead of you. It's worth it. As a recent article, if you get a chance, there's something by David Brooks just wrote really recently talking about the struggle and how meaning in life and everything has that struggle, and that's what makes it so enjoyable in our work. We seek this kind of thing. Students don't back down. They're not going to leave our classes if you tell them it's going to be a challenge. They want to know it's real, and they want to know what to expect, but they want to be equipped. And I think the only way to equip them is to have that honest conversation. You're going to feel this way. It's going to be difficult. This is not a 9-to-5 job that you're taking with a steady income. And with that, there's an intense amount of volatility. How are you going to manage those? I have other research. I could talk about that in our general panel, I guess. But I just wanted to kind of say those remarks before we kind of open it up to our more general discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There's a uncertainty game we play in my house called What's the Worst That Could Happen? So point very well taken. I'd love to move towards a conversation among you four. And you all have touched on it to a certain extent, but I'd love to hear you in conversation. What do you think faith and entrepreneurship research can contribute mostly to first finding and then evaluating sources and practices for well-being and flourishing? We're all in this faith and entrepreneurship sphere to one degree or another. What's it going to do for the human, for the community? I'd love to hear.
I'll take a swing really quickly. I want to steal this from a friend of mine because I thought it was a great point he made, Professor at Baylor. And Blaine McCormick said what he thought we bring to the table, being able to talk about faith in the classroom, is death. This sounds bad, but you talk about the end, and you look at the end, and you're like, what do you want your life to mean? And many times in most of our culture, at least in the U.S., I would think in most of the places I've been, we avoid death. We don't like to talk about it. We don't want to have these conversations. We don't want to talk about the end. There's been a lot of mismanagement of elder care and stuff like that as a result of some of these problems, because cultures don't want to talk about that stage of life. But the fact is, you cannot really think about how I want to be today if I don't think about how I want to be at the end. What's the end journey? What's the end outcome? What's the point? What am I trying to do here? And I think it's a really powerful thing that we can do when we talk about faith and entrepreneurship. We can start with the end in mind. And whether that's that eulogy exercise or legacy exercise, what do we want to talk about? It's the framing to say, okay, this is what a successful life would look like. Now, where does my venture fall into that? How does entrepreneurship fall into that? What am I willing to sacrifice or not sacrifice? What am I willing to trade off to make that happen? And how do I keep that bounded and ethical and constrained and not go off the rails as we've seen so many entrepreneurs do, because they've lost sight, right? They lose that net wealth framework and they start thinking gain loss very myopically. And that's where we usually see ethical problems happen. So these are discussions that start with the end in mind, and the end is death, unfortunately, for all of us human beings. So I think that is something that we can talk about, and not in some morbid way, but in some realistic and hopeful way. And that's a very big difference, I think.
I'll chime in and give the complementary point, I think, which is it's not just the outcome, but it's the daily actions and the process through which we achieve those outcomes. So when we think about well-being, it's, yes, I want to be healthy. I don't want to burn out. I either am avoiding some, eternal damnation, to Jeff's point of the outcome, or I want to get into heaven, or whatever that is. But there's also a huge recognition in the faith journey about daily practices and treat others the way you want to be treated and create the life that you want for that end. And so I think there's a lot more attention and agency, which we know a lot about in entrepreneurship, about how do you create that ultimate goal or that kind of life or that Christian-led life or whatever it is, faith-led life that you want for yourself and your family. And so there is this recognition that it's not just the outcome, it's the process through which you get there, that I think if we fully embrace a religious perspective, or at least a lot of that, and the teachings that many of us had growing up, it is the daily practice. It is the every action has this kind of underlying meaning or motivation to it that I think we can bring in to help understand well-being in entrepreneurship and help have those conversations about what are you doing daily to prevent yourself from burning out? What are you doing daily to make sure you have meaningful connections to other individuals or your own self, or all of these things that you want to create that life that you want for yourself? And so I think that's a unique advantage of something that we can bring together, or even to Tom's points about what kind of community do you want to create this civic wealth, and how do you become part of that and be part of that wealth creation, not just take advantage of the wealth that's already in a community.
Maybe just to chip in, so I really like the conversation, and I think at the point of being a little bit redundant, I think it's really important that we're not talking enough about the goalpost, I think. And maybe it's not just that, but it's also this, that there is more to you, right, than just the entrepreneur being. You're also a being in a completely different context. And if you think about what helps in terms of resilience and getting through uncertain times, it's that your life isn't contingent entirely on one state of being, but you have something else to fall back to as well. And so I see kind of religion coming through in so many different ways, from the daily practice, absolutely. If you think mindfulness comes out of a, religious practice effectively. So there's those things. There is the kind of how do you set your goals? And I think, how do you define success? And I think this is actually a question we should ask many more times when we teach entrepreneurship. So, and if the answer is our success is earning a lot of money, then I think the next question should be, so what are you going to do with the money? So why do you want the money? What's the money good for? Because it's only good for something, and you want to buy maybe something with that. So what's the next thing you want from that? And then maybe get to a conversation where actually maybe I want, reputation, but maybe also success would be building something to my own, desire. And I think that opens up a nice conversation to say then, well, do you really need all that venture investment? Because then you're giving your agency to somebody else, and you may not have control over the goals any longer. So I think it really helps to develop a different type of mindset of how you approach the venturing itself. And yeah, absolutely. I think the community point and, civic wealth point is so important that, even though we think of entrepreneurs typically, and we still, I think most of us research entrepreneurs as individuals, they're clearly part, often sometimes of teams, but they're clearly part of communities. And I think that interface is so important. And I'm sure Tom has many more things to say to that.
I was going to add a small process point, but it wasn't a civic wealth creation point. So, thanks for the send up. I was simply going to say, there's a religious experience aspect of this. The process. I mean, if we think about, this being an experience being a religious experience, I think that part of what we can look for in the research is the extent to which again, this, I was going to say, not to be too lofty, this is lofty. The extent to which the experience is transcendent, so there's a tiny bit of research written about, the idea of it being nonlinear and irrational and unrehearsed and spontaneous. And actually, I think entrepreneurs may be a little better at that than, say, managers. But at the same time, I think that that's something that would be interesting to research, the idea of the extent to which it is a religious experience, that in the sense of being a transcendent and intuitive experience of being entrepreneurial, that is. And there's probably something that could inform the rest of the working population by researching that.
I wonder if I could ask a question in the opposite direction then, in just a few minutes, and swing at it if you want to. Do you see the integration of faith and entrepreneurship as possibly causing ill-being or unsettling and what might that look like? A lot of times we tend to talk about faith and entrepreneurship as moving in a positive direction. What happens when it doesn't?
Oh, I'm sorry. Go
No,
ahead.
please go, Jeff. Go.
I was just going to say, you can't always worry about in-group, out-group effects. I think that's the number one thing, almost always. I mean, unfortunately, um, I mean, you see this in any society. I mean, you talk about uh, if everybody's a particular religion and you're not, it's very, very difficult. It's going to create a an incredible challenge. Even and it wouldn't have anything to do. It doesn't have to have anything to do with leaving people out or discriminating or anything. It could just come down to overlapping circles of life, right? And that those people have connections over and over and over. And you see this in many societies where, I mean, if you're in Utah and you're not LDS, maybe it's you feel that to some extent. If you are in Waco, Texas, at Baylor, and you're not Baptist, you might run into that, and it happens, right? And so it's not the side of faith that we want to talk about, but it is one that we have to be very much aware of when we're talking about religion and entrepreneurship. And we talk about the positive side of network effects, where somebody's tapping into their Christian network or something like that. Well, what does that mean if you're outside of that network, And so I think that discussion needs to happen, and it needs to happen. Like, how do you take the good without having to take the bad? Is there a way to minimize those kinds of frictions and yet still take the positive that we're talking about with the anxiety reduction and the meaning in life and all these things that we know and we want? How can we still have that and still live in a liberal culture where any faith works, if that's where you're called to, practice, and still have business work successfully and still not have discrimination pop up? Because I think that's the biggest concern.
I'll chime in a little bit differently and just say there's a phenomenal individual at Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, Ash Biru, who's studying entrepreneurship in Ethiopia. And in that context, one's entrepreneurial goals and one's religious goals are in direct conflict. And he and I have many conversations about, in the religious tradition there, if your business grows large, that's bad. If your business is super successful, that's bad because you are no longer humbled before your deity. And so this is directly creating dissonance and cognitive dissonance and strategies in which to not hide, but share that civic wealth that you're creating, that economic wealth that you're creating. They give away parts of their business to family members, other things. I think we have no knowledge or understanding really of how and why religion constrains entrepreneurial action and ways in which entrepreneurs must act very counter-normative to what our research would say they should act. In order to preserve their faith traditions. And so I think there's a whole lot of opportunity. Is it that religion's hurting entrepreneurship? No, but it's definitely constraining what we would normally think of as success for entrepreneurs. And I think we could benefit from doing a lot more work on where is it limiting or challenging what we think we know about entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial success, and how do those individuals manage those competing tensions, responsibility to faith, to family, to pride, to all kinds of things where we want to grow. And that's a marker of success and reputation. But in fact, that's bad in the eyes of our deity and what we're supposed to be trying to achieve in our lives. And that, to me, that's incredibly fascinating. And from a North American perspective, we have no knowledge about this and these processes whatsoever.
Got another one
Maybe.
oh, I'm sorry. I spoke twice here. If somebody else needs. I just
No,
really
go for it.
I guess just really quickly, the one that came to mind was like cheapening our faith. If you start using the faith as a business tool, it can just completely suck the meaning out of it and make it into something disgusting and the antithesis of what it's supposed to be. So I think that that's a very real concern, and that is one we see regularly in practice. So that is a research topic that I can't believe we haven't seen a lot of research on yet, because it's just widespread. It's a major problem, and I don't think it doesn't necessarily have to start that way either. I mean, the person could have all the best intentions in the world, and before long, it just becomes shallow and superficial, and a tool for self-actualization, or a tool for wealth, and not a meaningful practice.
I was going to say something slightly similar, as in when religion becomes instrumentalized as like almost a human resource management tool. So I had a fantastic PhD student a while ago, Sandrine Tunit-Server, who did research in the north of Ghana, microfinance institutions, and there were not all of them, but some really using religion to kind of manage their workforce and keep the loan collectors on very low salaries. They were exposed to a lot of potential for physical harm even, but the rhetoric was always, you know, your reward will be in the afterlife. And so put up with what is, you know, allegedly very, well, it is meaningful work, but not if it comes at the risk of your own safety. So I think that's a slippery slope. I think that, you know, I think, as Jeff said, that probably when they started out, it was very well-meaning, but then at some point, maybe it was you know, with all the resource pressures there are, that seemed like a viable route to go. So I think that we need a bit more attention to that. And then I also always wonder whether, and I'm thinking here maybe of some of the social entrepreneurs, can there be too much meaningful work, right? So if you feel that the purpose of your business is also tied into a religious purpose, and then how can you, you know, ever step away from that in terms of affordable loss? That seems kind of a double bind. Yeah, I think that's something to be mindful of.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Our first panel, Tom, Ute, Melissa, Jeff, thank you so much. We'll move on to Brett moderating the Emerging Scholars panel. Thank you.